Everybody talks about logic games being removed, a second scored logical reasoning section being added, but what almost nobody realizes is that there were other more subtle changes hidden inside logical reasoning itself. And these changes are just as important, maybe even more important, if you're taking the LSAT in 2026 and beyond. And so today I'm going to walk you through exactly what changed, why it matters, and the specific LSAT question types you're going to see more often. Now, everyone knows that LSAC removed logic games, but they don't know why. A group of blind test takers sued LSAC, arguing that the need to diagram logic games created an unfair disadvantage. LSAC settled the lawsuit and agreed to create a redesigned test without a logic game section. And so LSAC had two options. They could either build a new LSAT section from scratch or take something they already had and expand it. And so they chose the second option. So now you get two scored logical reasoning sections, not one. And that is the obvious update. But the part that almost nobody's talking about is that the moment logic games disappeared, logical reasoning quietly shifted to fill the gap. So ever since the June 2024 LSAT, the first test without games, students have been reporting the same thing. LSAT logical reasoning now has way more questions involving formal logic and conditional reasoning than ever before. We're seeing more if X then Y structures, more contrapositives, more chain rules, more necessary versus sufficient conditional traps, more numbers versus percentages confusion, and more arguments where diagramming would actually be helpful. LSAC is exploiting what I call a logic loophole. Because while they removed the logic game section, nothing in the lawsuit prevented LSAC from testing logic games concepts inside logical reasoning instead. And so they didn't break the rules. They did remove logic games, but they shifted the location of those concepts being tested. And so when I'm talking about formal logic or conditional reasoning, I'm talking about questions built around statements like, if XA happens, then B must happen, or if only X, then Y, or no R's or S's. And so these often link together, like if A, then B, if B, then C. Therefore, if A, then C, you could feel the conditional chain starting to form. And technically, these are still logical reasoning questions with short paragraphs, one question each. But inside those paragraphs, you'll sometimes find structures that look a lot like mini logic games. And for the average LSAT taker, somebody who's under pressure, working quickly, the mental load is almost too much to hold in your short-term working memory. And so that's why diagramming becomes useful again. And these are not imaginary trends or some radical new question type. They come straight from official LSAC material. And they have been on the exam for years. They're now just showing up more frequently. So for example, we had a question in Prep Test 111 about inspired musical performances that contains a conditional logic chain where drawing out the relationships helps tremendously. There's also a question from Prep Test 117 about Clara Schumann. It's a flaw question testing numbers versus percentages, one of LSAC's favorite traps. There's also a question in Prep Test 124 about April rainfall. It's a parallel reasoning question. This is a classic question where you want a diagram and it's all about the structure. You also have a question in Prep Test 130 about handmade wigs. This is a sufficient assumption question where a single missing link in the chain makes or breaks the argument. And these are scattered across dozens of exams over the course of several decades. These question types have always existed, but LSAC is now just showing them more often. Now, LSAC loves to say diagramming is not required, and technically that is true. But in practical terms, for most people, diagramming makes all the difference between guessing and understanding. When you have multiple conditional chains, overlapping rules, subtle distinctions between necessary and sufficient conditions, and tricky number percentage twists, your brain can't hold all of that in while you're under test day pressure. That is cognitive overload. And that's how you get lost in the weeds. And so even without logic games, diagramming is still a great high-performance strategy. And will there be another lawsuit about this diagramming type questions that are being, but the lawsuit was about diagramming games, not diagramming logic. And so LSAC still has significant flexibility within the logical reasoning section. So for now, the loophole still stands. And so going into 2026 and beyond, there is every reason to expect these trends will continue. And so if you're taking the LSAT in 2026 or beyond, you want to train more heavily in conditional reasoning, contrapositives, chains and inferences, numbers versus percentages, formal logic structures, parallel reasoning, and necessary assumption, because the most common high-impact question types in logical reasoning are still necessary assumption, inference, and flaw. These three show up way more often than anything else. So you always want to master these deeply before spending time on the lower frequency categories. Not randomly studying, you want to upgrade the quality of your prep so that you're not blindsided by a new version of logical reasoning. Again, these are not some wild new question type out of nowhere. The examples I gave go back 25 years or more. The change is only in the frequency and placement of these concepts. You'll see them being tested more often in the scored sections, and you will definitely see them in the unscored experimental section, which is LSAC's way of testing future trends. If you understand this shift, it gives you a massive advantage over students who are still studying the LSAT of 2019. So the LSAT will continue to evolve, but the core skills that matter, reasoning, precision, clarity of thought, these are the same ones that law school and real legal work demand. So if you train those deeply, strategically, and intelligently, you will adapt to whatever LSAC throws your way.